Welcome to the ResearchWorks podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the ResearchWorks podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Hello, everyone. We're so glad you're able to join us for another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast.
Today's episode is pretty special. We are so excited to have the opportunity to line up calendars to speak with the one and only Dr. Peter Rosenbaum. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And can you tell us what time are we talking to you over in your time zone there?
It's 8 o'clock at night.
Oh, thank you so much.
For your yesterday and your turn.
Yeah, you're coming to us from the past.
Always feels that way. And I feel like 8 p.m. is quite late. So I really do appreciate that you've joined us here today, because I find that around 8, I'm winding down and I'm ready to go to sleep. But yes, it's amazing that we've been able to tee this up, and it's just such an honour to be able to speak with you, because there's, I think, so many of the topics we've already spoken about over the last few years really does reference a lot of the work that you've been part of and have been leading. And today we're going to really centre our conversation around a paper that you published in 2021 with your co-author Monica Novak-Pavlik in Current Developmental Disorders Reports, which is titled Parenting a Child with Neurodevelopmental Disorder.
And this paper is one that we know anyone who's working in child health should read and should be kind of using to start conversations with families and caregivers. But before we get into the paper, we'd like to tell everyone a little bit more about you, Peter. So Peter is a professor of paediatrics and an associate member of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at McMaster University. In 1989, Peter co-founded the award-winning CanChild Centre for Childhood Disability Research, a health system-linked research unit that is recognised worldwide for its research and dissemination activities. Peter is a contributing author to over 430 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. He's been an invited lecturer and keynote speaker in over 30 countries.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, Peter. And I think that's the beauty of research, isn't it? We're just continually building on each other's work, and it's sharing that work to have an impact, not just where you are, but globally. I mean, clearly we're here in Australia talking about the impact, which is pretty cool.
So, Peter, we like to start our episodes with an icebreaker question to help all of us get to know each other a little bit better and help our listeners get to know all of us a little bit better as well. Today's a bit of a deep one, but I really love to hear both of your answers to this.
Okay.
So, Dana and Peter, how do you motivate yourself to take on difficult tasks?
Oh, ladies first.
Oh, God. I was ready to handball that one to you. That's a deep one for sure. All right. Based on that chivalry, let's think about it. I would say one way I do motivate myself is by having a very clean environment. I'm one of those people that is really good at procrastination. Mm-hmm. So I can motivate myself to do something really difficult if I clean the space. Like, my house will be beautiful, and then I'll sit there with this clean space and therefore a clean brain of which to do some work. But on a more serious note, I've recently been taking on like my top 5 tasks that I want to try to accomplish in a day. Ooh. Because I find that as a researcher, you've got a lot of work to do, but it's not like you can fully accomplish something in a day. Like, it's ongoing. So I find that just having a few tick boxes, so I like to write it out with a little box there so I can tick it away as I'm going along. So it makes me feel like I'm chipping away at this big task.
Yeah.
That's me. Peter, what about you? I guess I'd have to think about what I mean by a difficult task. If it's an easy task, then it's obviously something you can knock off pretty quickly. I think the difficult tasks are much more interesting because they require us to think and to see whether we can relate what we think we know already to what the issues are.
Yeah.
So for me, these are usually intellectually challenging issues, which I'm happy to wrestle with. I also, in thinking about what Dana said about writing, I've come to realize that you can draft some ideas, leave them and come back to them, whether it's in an hour or a day.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how much marination has gone on in your brain in the meantime. So things become less difficult with time, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Especially when you're writing something, and sometimes you've got to get something down, don't you? And and start to allow the process to happen.
Yeah. And allow clarity to form from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of my rules is never ever write sentences. Write bullet points.
Yes.
Because a sentence requires thoughtful construction.
Sure.
You know, what's the noun, what's the verb, what are the adjectives, and so on.
Yes.
Whereas bullet points are the key ideas. And it's amazing. In fact, if we're going to talk about the F words a little bit. The F words paper was written in a day or less than a day because we had a talk that had all the bullet points. And by converting the PowerPoint text into a Word file, the paper was there. It just needed to be crafted into sentences.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I love that.
Like that. I really like that, Peter. Ash, what about you? Where does this come from?
So the way, my answer's just changed. I now make sure I have a podcast recording with Peter Rosenbaum and Dana Poole to help motivate me to take on difficult tasks. But I feel like I've got lots of handy hints now. I'm taking mental notes furiously. No, I like to, and maybe it relates to how you started with your answer, Peter, but what motivates me is thinking about why. Why am I taking on, this task is difficult, but why am I taking it on? And what is the motivation for doing it? And often, that helps sometimes with the clarity around why. And then it's a matter of the process of actually getting the job done. So like you, I like to make lists, or just, set a goal for that day or that block of time I've got to work on something and break it down into manageable, achievable bites, I guess.
Yes. No, that's really good.
I think it's also important to think about what makes us think that that's a difficult task.
Yeah.
What might be difficult for me wouldn't be for you, and vice versa. So what is it that's making it difficult? What making me perceive that it's difficult?
Yes.
That is such a good point.
Definitely.
That is such a good point. Because I don't think I've ever really thought about what's difficult and what's a simple task. Simple, sometimes you can just, like you said, you can just knock it off. But difficult task is usually deep thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's, a project and what the outcome might mean.
And for me, I think it depends on the day as well. Something that I might find really difficult one day, I might revisit, when I've had a little bit more sleep or, a bit more time to clarify things, and it becomes a less difficult task.
No,
so
that's good. Well, this paper we're about to talk about is all about thinking, and I love this paper, and I know that all of our listeners are going to love this as well. So let me give you a bit of a rundown about what this paper is. So traditional thinking and focus in childhood disability have been on the child with the impairment to make the right diagnosis and find the right treatments. The expectation here is that the intervention should fix the problems, which has led to the process of professionals conducting the investigation and management, with parents expected to comply with the professional's recommendations. There is certainly much less attention that's being paid to parents' perspectives and their well-being. So with the ICF and the F words for child development, we recognise now the family as the unity of interest and the parents' voices as essential elements to all aspects of management. There's some important implications of these developments on structure, processes and content of services for children with neurodevelopmental disorders, their families and the services designed to support them.
Thank you, Dana.
Welcome.
All right. I'm very excited to get stuck into this conversation with you, Peter. And I feel like we had a little bit of a taster when you alluded to the paper on the F words just now. But I've also been to a few of your talks where I've heard a lot about the origins of the F words, of childhood development. So can you share with our listeners the story of how the F words came about?
We at CanChild had, in a way, an inside track on the ICF, which very briefly was an upgrade of the 1980 effort by the World Health Organization to think about disability. The 1980 version never worked particularly well, but in the late 90s, a lot of work was done internationally, including now with the voices of people with disabilities. And one of my colleagues, Deb Stewart, was part of the Canadian WHO beta testing group. And so we were hearing about these ideas and getting very excited about this integrated biological, psychological, social, biopsychosocial framework. And so very quickly, when it was published in 2001, we started to use it, to teach it, to talk about it. And I think that what it did was it reminded us actively, by virtue of the structure of the framework, that there was more to the story than the body structure and function. And I have a brief anecdote from my family. When my wife was pregnant with one of our children, an older child was very interested in what was going on. She was 3.5 at the time and pretty bright and could read. So when she asked about what was going on, we showed her the book, which every parent should have and does have, and explained the second half of the story, and left the book on her dresser. And the next morning we came in and she was reading, and she said, "Mom, there's a whole other part of this book."
That's good.
And I slightly frivolous story to say that when we look at the ICF framework, we see that there's more to the story than the body structure and function. There are the consequences of an impairment on activity, on participation, and everybody knows that we should be thinking about environmental factors and personal factors, but now we're expected to. And it's not enough to say, "Oh yeah, everybody knows that." We now have to say, "Well, look at this interconnected set of ideas." And very gradually, we started throwing around words that would bring the ICF to life. And in 2011, I was asked to give a talk in the UK to a children's treatment center with parents and service providers. And we thought, just for fun, Jan Willem Horter, my colleague, and I, that we should try to see if we could capture these ideas. And that's how this started. Wow. And it started as a talk. And as I said before, once we had the talk and the text, Jan Willem said we should write this up. And boom, it got written up and published in a week.
Wow. That's very inspiring.
It was just a throwaway idea that's gone crazy.
And clearly the fact that it has such a quick uptake, it means something to people. People recognize that, because we want to see the other side of the story. You know, we don't want to just see we have the ICF and the arrows point to each other. They have the bidirectional arrows. And that was a good attempt to make us think about the whole picture, but there was just more to it. And I think that's why people love using this framework.
I think the F words are really a tongue-in-cheek, a bit of fun. If the original paper was called "The F Words for Childhood Disability," I swear this is how we should think. Shameless pun, but I think the F words bring the ICF framework to life.
It does,
Body structure and function, activity, participation, they're important words, but for a lot of families, they don't have as much meaning as fitness and function and functioning and fun and so on.
It's really made that concept accessible and palatable for everyone.
It
I
really
think,
has.
which,
Yep. We had a holiday special that was released just over a month ago with the young Emily Pryor, and she's an intelligent, wonderful young lady with cerebral palsy, and she basically talked to us about her whole perspective using the F words as the framework. She went through every single thing, and I was so impressed by her saying, what's important for me, what do I find fun, why I do this because of my friends and my family, and I think about my future and what my function and fitness do for me now for that. And it was a wonderful dialogue and great for her, but it helps us to think about it as health professionals.
She's a very articulate spokesperson for these ideas, and certainly for people who have apparent impairments.
It's really, really incredible. So no, thank you for talking through those, just the origins of the F words. And I wish I could write a paper in a day, and that's my goal. I think
I've got 2 goals from this: be able to write a paper in a day and make sure there's as many puns as possible in the titles of your papers.
It did draw me to that paper. I remember seeing it going, whoa, I want to see this one. Look, so sort of building on that as a bit of a framework now, I really want to talk through these 3, I don't know where my emphasis and my syllables are going to go here. 3 premises. Yep. Okay, 3 premises, and its implications for parents and professionals. So let's start with premise 1. Children live in a context of family and community. And this, on the outset, it seems so obvious, but why is it so important for you to have stated this in the paper?
Things are obvious when people point them out. And I talk when we lecture about the F words, which we do a lot, teach about the F words. I make the point that I always use the word we, because I'm not pointing my finger at you and telling you you should smarten up. I trained a long, long time ago with very good people and was very well trained, I think, in the concepts of the time. But there were things in front of our noses that we just didn't see. And I'll come back to this at the end with reference to something I've written recently. The biomedical, the tyranny, and I will say that rudely, the tyranny of the biomedical thinking about childhood disability has, I think, constrained our ability to see beyond the child. We're so busy making the diagnosis with the assumption that the right diagnosis will lead to the right treatment. And we talk about this a little bit in the paper. And that's really important in acute care situations with a sudden chest pain or sudden difficulty with breathing or sudden abdominal pain, where there may literally be life-saving treatments based upon the right diagnosis. But when we import that into our field of developmental difference and a developmental impairment, basically all bets are off. And it is very rare. There are examples, but it is rare in our field that a specific diagnosis leads to a specific treatment. And I hope to irritate a lot of people by saying this. Almost nothing that we do in our interventions is condition specific. When there's a lot of specialness about certain conditions, and I won't be rude about that, but the interventions that we offer around autism are not about autism as such. They're about behavior or communication or social functioning. And those are not specific to people with autism. They are about the functional issues. So as we began to see that there was another part of the story, especially with the ICF framework, we saw environment, and we, in our words, and our F-word family, and recognized that every child we ever see comes with a family around them. And a related concept is this: if I have back pain and I go to see my physician, my presenting complaint is back pain and its functional consequences. If I'm a parent with a child who isn't walking or talking or isn't behaving easily, the presenting complaint is my child, which is a different individual. But the child isn't there saying, help me because I don't talk good. The parent is there because the child is having difficulty. And so if we recognize that and think about that, then it is the family that is the presenting. Patient is the wrong word, but they're the people whose issues we have to address.
And they're the ones seeking the help and support.
Yeah. And they're not just there to take our advice and do the things we tell them to do. They're there for us to help them understand their dilemma, which is their child's impairment. And again, that's terribly obvious, and yet we just haven't behaved that way in the past. We, including me. So I'm not throwing bricks at anybody else.
It's a really, I mean, like you said, it's only obvious when you point it out, but when you think deeply and you reflect on your own thoughts and your processes as health professionals, you know, the idea that a parent does come to you seeking help, you really are dealing with a parent with their own interpretation of how this is impacting them, how the world might be perceiving them, what are the expectations being placed on me. And there's a lot of that before you even think about the child itself. You know, there's so many factors to be considering right in that initial presentation, isn't there?
And I suspect that the three of us are never, ever the first people to see the child and family. So it's important to know what the parents have been told. What are the expectations? You know, go and see the therapist. They'll fix things. That's a hell of a burden on you. Or, you know, dumping things into the lap of the developmental pediatrician who will sort things out. What are the parents' expectations of us? What have they been told these days? What have they read on the internet? What do the grandparents think? And so on. They arrive with considerable amounts of information, some of it accurate, some of it perhaps inaccurate. But we need to understand that as well so we can connect.
And I guess it's teasing it out because you need to understand where they're coming from before you do start providing information. It's so individual, isn't it? And where they are in understanding what's happening in that situation too.
What's their question?
Yes. And so, Peter, when we try to make our practice family-centered and put the family at the center of what we're doing rather than the child that we're trying to fix in inverted commas, what does family-centered practice look like?
Starting off by asking parents, how can we be helpful? Asking them to boast about their children. Tell me about your child. And if what we get is a catalog of all the problems, that is not a criticism of the parents, but that is an indication that that's what they've been told is important. And so, you know, when they start telling me about the problems, what the child can't do, I say, hold on, we're going to get there. But I want you to tell me what you like about your child. I'm trying to change the nature and the tenor of the conversation to focus on the person who is rather than the person who isn't or the person who's broken. And I know that sounds awfully corny, but for many parents, nobody's ever asked them.
This is such important points, aren't they? And I'm so glad that we started with that as the first premise to really start thinking deeply about it and that initial presentation. What does that mean?
So the second premise, Peter, is the centrality of development in developmental disability and its importance for parenting. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because when I was reading the paper, this one, really struck a chord with me. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about what that means.
I've been working in the field of developmental disability for over 50 years. And when we say those words, what people hear is disability. What do we mean by developmental disability? How is it different for a 2-year-old to have motor impairment related to spina bifida or cerebral palsy and me at very much more than 2 years old to acquire a motor disability, a motor impairment? And the premise, which it took me a very long time to recognize, is that the conditions with which we're involved and interested are having or are likely to have an impact on the child's development. And so I use examples like identical twins, one of whom has cerebral palsy, and they're 2 years old and therefore junior adolescents. And one of them can run around and get into what we call mischief, and the other one with a significant motor impairment cannot do that. Not only is it sad that the child can't move, but that's having profound developmental impact.
Yeah.
And evidence to support what I'm saying comes from many sources, including, for example, the impact of providing powered mobility to 2-year-olds with significant motor restriction, and how that opens their world. It empowers them both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
And suddenly other people see that child differently and interact with that child differently. The child is getting into what we call mischief.
Yeah.
And mischief is never prescribed in the sense that you should go out and get into trouble so we can yell at you. But when children are enabled to do that, they get the social consequences of that. I used to see a girl many years ago who was an ex-prem with probably level 4 cerebral palsy by today's jargon. And her mom came in one day when Jenny was 6, and I asked how things were going. Her mother had a big smile. She said, the other day, Jenny's power wheelchair wouldn't start. And I said to Jenny, this is the mother, I said to Jenny, did you go through the hose on the lawn? And Jenny said no. And her mother took the top off the motor, and out came all this water. And so Jenny was grounded for telling a lie. But her mother was, smart enough to recognize how terrific that was, because that was ordinary nonsense of kids. And so, that I think illustrates the value of being able to explore the world. And Jenny, with 1,000 years of therapy, Jenny would still have cerebral palsy and would still have level 4 cerebral palsy. But Jenny was going to a regular school, and Jenny was having a really good life.
And when you talk through that premise, Peter, and when I hear that story about Jenny, which I absolutely love, I come back to the conversation we had with Christine about just attending or actually being able to be involved in your world, just showing up. And I feel like, this shift from it being enough for kids to just be there and to show up and sit while, people are doing things around them, being able to include them and have them be involved in their world is so critical.
As active agents.
That's right.
In whatever way they do it.
That's right. And I think on that as well, one of the things that I do a lot in my practice is supporting children getting into walking frames as early as possible, or supported stepping, or whatever the word might be for it. And it's so funny when that does happen and they do have a walking frame they can use at home. The parents come back and they're like, they're just everywhere. I don't know where they are right now. I used to just put them down somewhere and that's where they'd be, but now they're just everywhere. And I'm like, well, that's a good problem to have, and I'm not going to apologize for it as long as it's safe. But the point is always just to get up and move in whatever way that might look, and the child is feeling more fulfilled. And that's always highly linked to their development. And whether I always talk about families, it's their cognitive development, it's the social constructs that happen from that. So now they're involved. It's the same kind of thing, isn't it?
But you are of a different generation than I was brought up in, where if you couldn't do it properly and nicely, you shouldn't do it. And another example that I cite very often is the 1988 study published by Fred Palmer and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins in the United States. And this was a study, it was a randomized clinical trial, and one of the early decent clinical trials in our field. And they randomized toddlers with diplegic cerebral palsy. I think the children ranged in age from 12 to 19 months, and they were randomized to 6 months of NDT therapy or 6 months of an early intervention program. Were reassessed at 6 months, and then all of the children got 6 more months of NDT therapy. And I know from knowing these folks who are good folks and knowing the philosophy, they expected that the NDT therapy would be much better. The kids getting NDT therapy would be much better than functioning than the kids in the early intervention program. It was the opposite. At 6 months and at 12 months, the children who were, and these are my words, allowed to get on with it, pulling to standing with their ugly crouched gait, getting around on, however they were getting around, they were learning.
Yeah.
And the punchline of the story, and I wrote an editorial about this some years ago. I think the punchline at the time was nobody said, "What the hell's going on here? We should be doing more early intervention."
Yeah.
There was disappointment about the fact that the NDT treatment hadn't done a better job.
Right.
Because the belief was so strong, not just in NDT, but in all our biomedical interventions.
Yes.
And I often characterize this as a tension between an approach to the biomedical problem and a focus on development. And I will take development 100 times out of 100 over making the biomedical part better.
Yeah. And trying to, I suppose, fix things before children are allowed to get on with it. It's once they can do this, then they're allowed.
These are the steps you need to take.
Once you can walk, once your motor skills are better, you'll pick up your bed and walk. Well, there's good evidence that does not happen. We can change impairments. Virginia Wright's PhD thesis showed this beautifully. Very big changes in range of motion and Ashworth scales after Botox, but no measurable change in activity or participation.
Yeah. As you describe that, I think of how you said it's that sort of different generation. I feel like I sort of straddled that because how I was trained. So I've been a physiotherapist now for nearly 20 years. And when I was first trained in neuro, I'll just say neuro generally, was you write out the activity limitations and what are the contributing impairments that are contributing to that. And therefore you fix all the impairments first. So you can't stand. So let's work on range of motion, strength, whatever it might be. And you sort of really look at that and then you can look at the activity. And then I was NDT trained, again, by amazing people that had, beautiful hearts, best intentions. And I learned a lot from them. But I remember sort of the thought of going, all right, these are tone influencing patterns and how do I reduce tone in their upper limb? And I remember thinking, wow, this is what real physios do. You sit there and you're touching the child, you're changing, you're externally rotating the arm and look at how beautiful they are. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Your hands go off and the child just flops down and you kind of go, well, how are they actually going to function in real life with me attached to them every single day so that they look the way that we expect them to look and therefore function, but all we're doing is holding them back. And it was really mind-boggling for me, actually. I felt like a lot of things shattered as I sort of started to really understand what was happening, I guess. Yeah.
And we've always had good intentions. I never, ever have attributed bad motives to the people who have put these ideas forward and tested them. I think the problem has been a belief that went way beyond the evidence and difficulty with accepting the evidence that this wasn't doing what we wanted it to do.
Yeah. And I still think we're still there for some of the interventions, aren't we?
Because things gain momentum before the evidence kind of catches up with them, and they're already so far down the path that the evidence is almost scrambling to keep up and often doesn't.
And I think social media is part of that, because information is so readily available. We've spoken about this quite a few times because everyone's seeking information. So they have this information seeking phase and they go online and they see these things and they go, look, the head control is so much better if you do these things. And it's a matter of then, like you said, going back to the first premise, it's kind of like, why has that family brought that child to you? Let's understand what it is that they're seeing, what they're expecting, I think, as well. There's a lot in that one, which I think leads really nicely to the next premise, which is premise 3, new thinking about disability and new frameworks. This, you speak a fair bit about, rehabilitation and how this relates to child health versus adult healthcare. Can you talk us through a bit more about this? Because I'm really interested in this one.
Well, in the same way that we have traditionally, with good intentions, imported diagnosis to treatment paradigms from acute care, we've also imported rehabilitation paradigms, which are extremely important in adults, to our field. And in adults, we have when people acquire an impairment, first of all, they have an idea and a clear account of what they could do before they acquired their impairment.
Sure.
They also, assuming they have cognitive ability, can tell us what's important to them. So for me, being able to talk is particularly important. Being able to walk is nice. And being able to feed myself is nice. But, I would want to work on, after a stroke, I would want to work on communication as a particularly important aspect of my life.
Yeah.
And so we have if you like, a baseline or a target against which to measure progress. And I can tell you whether I'm satisfied with my progress in the course of my therapy. We don't have that with children. So our default has been normal development.
Yep.
And I think we say in the paper, and I say regularly, that normal is a dumb idea which we should get rid of.
Yep.
But if we think only about how nicely you hold your pen, and I probably offends OTs when I say this, it doesn't matter a damn how you hold your pen. But how much pencil therapy has there been over the years? So the children will hold their pencil or their pen nicely with a tripod grasp. Who gives a damn? You can hold your pen like this. Try it. Hold your pen in funny ways. You're still going to write the same way.
Yeah.
But we have had this tyranny of normal, that this is the normal way to do things, and that's what we must strive for. Instead of, I will say, tolerating, I would say more importantly, encouraging adaptation. If you can do it this way, that's great. The best example from ordinary life is that about 15% of the population are left-handed. And for a very long time in the Western world, I don't know what's going on in other parts of the world, being left-handed, you were forced to change.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, that's incredibly stupid.
Yep.
And it speaks to the tyranny of normal.
Yeah.
I remember that. I'm right-handed, but I remember my sister who was left-handed. And that first realization that my parents had, this was probably in the 80s, was, no, put the pen in the right hand. Like, try this. And she kept swapping it back, and she's able to write with the left hand. What's about that? But it was about, that came from a parental expectation of what that should look like.
Yeah.
Didn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not just, but where do the parents' expectations come from?
True.
That's the way it's done.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And it's there are many examples of the tyranny of normal. Milestones are another one.
Yes. Talk us through that one. That's just something we love talking about a fair bit.
Yeah.
Just, you just talk to us at milestones. Let's start there.
Milestones are averages.
Yeah.
When do children walk? You don't have to answer that, but I mean that's the example I use in clinic and the example I've used in my teaching for the last 40 years is, when do girls get their first period? 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 16 or 17.
Yeah.
I mean, how can we have a 6 or 7 or 8 year window for something that happens to half the world?
Yeah.
And yet be so tyrannical about milestones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think milestones for many parents are millstones. I think they create tremendous difficulty. Half the world is below average on anything.
Yeah. That's such a
if you
good
think
point.
about it that way, the question is not whether your child is walking at 12 months. What is your child doing?
Yeah.
So if they're crawling like a mad fool, then they're going to walk.
Yeah.
If they're bum shuffling or scooting or hitching or whatever term you use, they're going to walk at 18 months.
Yeah.
That's a recognized variation of motor development. And so we need to be much more flexible and thoughtful about milestones than just the number. We need to think about what children are doing. What's the quality of what they're doing?
Yes. And as someone who has 2 young children who perhaps didn't achieve those milestones bang on average, there was variation, and most of the time it was, after that kind of magic number that we have in our heads as parents. And even with all of the training and the reading that I've done in my job, there's still that little niggling voice in the back of your mind that says, "Oh, but they've turned 1 now.
Yeah,
she hasn't walked. When I wonder when that's going to happen, and when should I start to think a little bit more about that. And it's very hard to unlearn that really kind of, when it's coming at you from so many aspects within society, it is really hard to untrain your brain to think that way.
Especially at our work.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is so destructive. I've seen firsthand when, families have received, the news that they weren't expecting. They said, oh, well, I really need them to roll. They have to roll now. And I'm bringing them to you so they can roll. And you're like, well, there's other forms of mobility. Let's look at those. No, I really want to look at the rolling. And you realize the pressure that's been placed on that family and the therapist to look at that. And then I get very frustrated then when I see therapies or approaches that target that and say, you're doing these therapies, these very hands-on therapies like we're just talking about before, that will fix it. And there's a lot of fix it kind of language which pulls people in because that's where they're at.
I think we need to understand from parents where the concern comes from.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it may come from the grandparents. It may come from, and not to blame grandparents, I'm all in favor of grandparenting. But parents usually, they're looking on the website. Their nephew or niece is doing things that their child of the same age isn't doing, and we need to understand both where the concern comes from and what they think it means. And if we can think, and especially I do neonatal follow-up, and these are kids that are high risk for having cerebral palsy. So often the worry is that the failure to do something is an early manifestation of an impairment. And so, again, being able to say, well, they're not walking. I agree that they're 12 months old, corrected age, which is really important as well. And they're not walking. What are they doing? Well, they're crawling like crazy, and they're pulling up to stand.
Yeah,
they're going to walk. Their brain is programming their limbs to do alternate movement, and they're doing it very well. And quite frankly, at this point, it is much easier for them to crawl and get what they want than it is to walk. And by the way, you're going to be sorry when they can walk. But there's one additional element of this, of course, and that is that doing things in an ordinary way relieves the worry that they won't be able to do it.
Sure.
So it's not enough that they get around. I want them to walk, because until they can walk, they are failing to walk.
Yeah.
And so our advice can be to teach them to roll, in the example you were using before, or it can be to reassure them. To reassure parents. And say they don't need therapy to learn to roll. Learning to roll is not, for most people, a life-enhancing skill.
Yeah. And Peter, that I think comes back to one of the points that's raised in this paper about the value of being able to explain as clearly as possible to families both what is happening and what that might mean to kind of manage, I suppose, the expectations that other people are placing on them and they might be placing on themselves and their child, and really, speaking as clearly as possible and speaking the truth.
And speaking about functioning, as opposed to biomedical excellence. I don't know how many Tiger Woods there are. Tiger Woods started learning to play golf when he was 18 months old. Most good golfers didn't start at 18 months, and most athletes didn't start when they were 2. So our ability to predict later functioning is probably pretty limited early on. And our ability to recognize what is working, how it's working, and how this or that variation might play out in the short term and the long term becomes a really important part of what we can do as people with understanding of child development and experience with it.
It seems to come down a lot to assumptions. And I love in this paper you did say, the inconsistencies that we might accept within our own parameters. Like you had the great bike riding example. I really want we can hopefully talk through that one a bit more, and what we expect from children who have impairments and performing them in this sort of set way, yet we don't expect that for any of us when we're talking about, if we want to learn how to ride a bike. You said in the example, you might use training wheels, and the training wheels are there to aid them, and when they don't need them anymore, you take them away, and that's fine. That didn't hinder them, it helped them. And how this relates to children with cerebral palsy, for example, who might want to use a walker. Can you just talk us through a little bit more about those concepts?
I've had lots of fun with this one.
I bet you did.
First of all, I tell parents that all of us who are able-bodied probably at some point couldn't walk very well and probably held on to the furniture. And we're toddlers, and toddling is in the sense of being like a penguin is a typical part of early development. So, we need to recognize that we once were like that. We also need to recognize that in the course of development and keep talking about that change. I'll tell you about a child I saw this afternoon in a minute. Okay. The change that's happening, we take credit for it all as therapists and professionals. But in fact, it's a force of nature that even children with impairments change and develop.
Yes.
And so learning to do something like walk with a walker allows a child to do several things. First of all, to get, as I said earlier, to get the value of being able to be mobile. So you're motivated to do it some more. Second of all, the more you do it, the better you get at it. Third of all, with development, some of the things that were difficult before become less difficult. And so even if the walker becomes a permanent part of that person's mobility skill, which is, for me, no big deal. It's better than sitting around doing nothing. Often it's not. Often it's a temporary support on the way to learning the skill. Because again, and I want to emphasize this so strongly, and I do it with parents, children are constantly changing. And, we think that the only way they're going to change is with therapy. But in fact, they're going to change anyway. The child I saw this afternoon was recognized at birth to have many impairments and was found this week to have some very rare genetic syndrome, which basically puts a name to what she has. And the parents were very upset with this, although they were already, of course, aware that she was developmentally challenged. They were concerned because the sense was from the reading what they did on the internet that this was going to just really limit the child. And I asked them to tell me about whether she was changing. And as they began to think about it, they could give more and more and more examples of things she couldn't do last month that she can do now. And, I think it's really important for us to help parents recognize that change is happening.
Yes.
And I say to them, of course, we're going to take credit for all of it because we're terrific therapists and doctors. But the reality is that what we're trying to do is keep up with the natural changes that are happening and to give parents and children opportunities to exploit the skills that are emerging.
When you say that resonates with me so much because we know that there is maturation. Children are always developing. And I do hear all the time therapists taking credit for the child being able to do something. And I often say to the family, they were probably already developing anyway. Like it's about creating the opportunity of how they can use those skills in a way that's meaningful for them. And I guess that highlights why when we're doing studies and we're trying to look at interventions and how they work is, anecdotes are great stories to tell, but how do we know that child wasn't going to develop anyway versus have engaged in a therapy which was 80 hours every single day and, the family had to remortgage their house for it? Like, how do we know that particular therapy had the impact they wanted to when there is maturation? And I think that's an important point. But it's
the answer is we don't know, and almost certainly all of those therapies are a waste of time and money and effort and lost opportunity. Because when you're doing all that therapy, you're not out playing.
Yes.
When you're doing all that therapy, you're not listening to music or doing other stuff you could be doing.
Yep.
When parents say, why aren't you doing such and such? My answer is usually that there is either no evidence that such and such works, or that people have studied it and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And when you parents are reading things on the internet, if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah.
I don't want our clinic to look stupid because we're missing what somebody down the road is doing if what they're doing down the road actually works.
Yes. Yeah.
But lots of things that are promised don't actually work.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone said that the other day, didn't they, when in the podcast? It's too good to be true. It's probably too good to be true.
Is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, Peter, does taking a strengths-based approach to how we talk to families and how we encourage families to talk about their child, does that kind of encourage this focus more on development and what is happening rather than what isn't happening or should be happening and hasn't happened?
I believe it does. And it's very hard when you're a parent to have a sense that anything's changed from yesterday. What I said to this family, and I've said to many families, is what I'm suggesting you do with this 3-year-old is, let's say that just arbitrarily, the first day of the month, it happens to be the first day of the month, make a 5-minute video of her playing and eating and doing her ordinary stuff. And then, collect that on the first day of the month and look back after 2 or 3 months and say, oh my goodness, we'd forgotten that this was how she did it before, or she couldn't do it.
Yeah.
We don't see it when it's happening, when we're up close to it.
Yeah.
Another thing is to listen to what the daycare teacher says, or the school teacher, or your the child's aunt or uncle who looks after them for the day, and hear about the child in other circumstances. Because sometimes we hear about things and kids show us things that they don't do at home.
Yeah. That's so true.
And that's a function of environment, which is quite important. And we expect to see things in clinic because that's our setting. But maybe the kids are tired. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they don't want to perform. And maybe we need to listen to parents.
And when you talk a lot about that, I think of the traffic light system. Like, we've spoken to Ina Novak, we've spoken to Kathy Morgan, we've looked really closely at that traffic light system and, what's got the green light and the amber light in terms of the evidence of what therapies that might be engaged with. And then we've got the red light interventions. And we sort of touched on a little bit before, and there's some sort of interventions that people still find hard to maybe let go of because it's what they've always done. My question for you is, what's your advice on that? Because there's some red light interventions that we know of. There's some interventions that have not been studied yet, but have got similar features to those red light interventions, so they're not even named there yet. But they might still be highly engaged with. What's your advice to therapists who are looking at that and that pressure of kind of going, okay, what kind of therapies can I provide?
I think there are several things to say about that paper and that set of studies. First of all, it was published, at least 10 years ago?
The first one was, yes. Yep.
And so even if everything that was there was fully accurate, and I'm not sure that was necessarily true, it was a study of review studies.
Yes.
So that was a summation of the evidence at the time.
Yes.
And 10 years later, you probably have to do that whole piece of work again.
Yes.
Because things may have changed.
Yeah.
The second thing is, what do we mean by work? Does such and such work? Again, what's the question? And what you mean and what I mean, what the parent mean may be different.
True.
And so we need to be clear that does botulinum toxin work in cerebral palsy? Well, what do you want it to do? Does it decrease the spasticity? Does it help to increase range of motion? Yes and yes. Does it make a difference to function? Not very much. What's the question?
Yeah.
And so I think that the traffic light system has its limitations. One of probably the most dramatic aspects of that paper was they're far more red than yellow or green. In other words, we have lots more evidence about what doesn't work than what does work.
Yeah.
But I think we've been asking the wrong questions.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, all the children that are in all those studies still have cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
Yes.
And stem cells ain't going to fix that. What are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
That probably leads us into, and I feel like this has been an incredible conversation, and I've learned a lot from talking to you, Peter, but I would also encourage anyone who's listened to this to go back and read this paper in more detail as well, because it does delve into a lot of these things that we've covered in more detail, and is just a nice place to kind of reflect on these conversations, I think, as well. But I wanted to ask you, where to from here? So from this paper, is there, what are the next directions for your work and, for the research world in childhood disability more broadly? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that the next frontier, and sadly a frontier that's been there for a long time we haven't paid attention to, is what do the former children look like? I was at an American Academy for Cerebral Palsy meeting in Boston in 1980, when there was, for the first time that I was aware of, a symposium on adults with cerebral palsy. And, some of us said, oh, my God, of course, they grow up. And because of the balkanization of our systems in terms of ages, when you get to be 16 or 18 or 21 or whatever, your particular system, you fall off the cliff. And these children or former children, adolescents, disappear. They disappear from our view. They don't disappear from their family's view, and they don't disappear from the community. But they have traditionally been neglected. The adult world doesn't understand them. The adult world isn't kind to them, and so on. And so there's now a lot of work, I think, that for young people looking for academic careers, looking at the life course of people with conditions like cerebral palsy and spina bifida, and learning lessons from the adults. I would challenge you to find me one adult in 1,000 with cerebral palsy who says they just loved therapy and therapy made all the difference in the world. But that's where so much of our effort has been put. So the question to the adults is, what's important to you? And it is things like housing, friendships, intimate relationships, having a decent income, having a job, and so on. And those are things about which we do very little. Now, you can say, well, 3-year-olds aren't ready to go out to work. But if we take some of the lessons, and this is some work we're starting to do now, if we take some of the lessons from adults, so if we think about the F word future, which we added, what does the future look like? And what are the lessons from adults and from the parents of adults that we should feed back to our clinic, and working with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and talking with the parents about enabling and empowering kids to start learning how to do stuff. I'll tell you an anecdote that is particularly funny is an ex-prem that I used to see with cerebral palsy, whose mother is a very outspoken and very bright advocate. So I saw this little girl for several years, and at one point her mom came in and was quite incensed because I hadn't talked about Botox. I said, what do you mean? She said, you didn't tell us about Botox. I said, why would I tell you about Botox? And she said, because people use Botox for cerebral palsy. I said, yes, they do, but not for the kind of cerebral palsy your daughter has. There's no role for Botox. But she didn't know that, and I didn't blame her for knowing that. But I never thought to say, we're not going to talk about Botox. But the story that she wrote a couple of years ago, she sent me an email, and she said, you're going to really love this story. Her daughter was developing, and daughter's pretty bright, was developing awareness of how to deal with her toilet needs. And one day went into the bathroom, sat on the toilet, did a fairly substantial business, and then tried to clean herself. And made one hell of a mess, apparently. And she called her mother. Her mother came in and was apoplectic and was about to yell at her daughter. And she said, then you popped into my head and said, it's not, it's function that matters. And so she said, she settled down and said to her daughter, this is terrific. Now let's work on cleaning yourself. Again, it's an anecdote, but if we can help parents see their way to helping kids, even though it might take more time.
Yeah.
That this kind of independence is fundamental. You can't imagine going out with your friends to watch a movie and suddenly needing to use the toilet and being unable to manage.
That's right. Yep.
So we've got to sort of think where things are going toward the future and engage the kids and give them opportunities to try things and learn things early.
Yep.
I love that.
Oh, that's really, really good. And I think, I got so much out of this conversation, Peter, and I think everyone's going to be thinking really deeply about what it is they're doing. And it's okay to challenge ourselves to think about what we've always done might not always be the best way or in the best interest for the children that will one day become adults. And we spoke with Mark Peterson last year, and he was very passionate about, the fact that GPs were surprised that there was such things in adult with cerebral palsy, and that kind of just made us.
That was mind blowing.
Mind of it. But it's always about that. It's always about independence. And my big take home from this is it doesn't have to be done perfectly or the way that we expect it. Because I certainly don't do things the same way that everyone else does.
No.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
So why should we expect that from our kids as well?
My pen grip is atrocious.
Yes, mine's terrible.
Let me leave you with an anecdote, at least with an advertisement for which I get absolutely no reward. A couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, I did a presentation at my wife's book club, invited presentation, and I had people read My Left Foot. Now, My Left Foot is an autobiography. It's made into a very fine film. Mm-hmm. I recommend people find the book by Christy Brown, or at least look at the movie, which I think won Daniel Day-Lewis an Oscar as the young man with cerebral palsy.
Yes.
And the story briefly is that Christy Brown was born in 1932. The 10th or 11th of 20-odd children in a poor Irish family in Dublin, and had cerebral palsy. And his mother recognized that there were a lot of sparks there, even though he had significant functional limitations. The punchlines include the fact that at age 22, in 1954, he wrote and published a book called My Left Foot about his growing up and being able to use only his left foot, with which he learned to write and eventually to type.
Wow.
He became a very good author, and I recommend people read his work. He was compared favorably to James Joyce.
Wow.
He also was a very good artist. And so I wrote a paper about this sort of lessons from Christy Brown, and all the F words were there.
Wow. That's amazing.
He had family that supported him. He had fun. He was functional in his own ways. Yeah. And there's a very interesting set of anecdotes from his visit to a very well-known therapist who basically told him that as long as he used his left foot, he'd never be cured, he'd never walk, and he'd never talk. He didn't listen. So, my point is that these ideas, that's where we started the conversation. These issues have been there in front of our noses. But we weren't ready to see them.
And things only become obvious when you say them out loud.
That's a great point. Yeah.
When they're obvious.
That's really cool.
So much food for thought, Peter. Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. And I feel very privileged that we got to have this conversation with you. So thank you.
Very, very generous. Thank you. Thank you so much. And to all our listeners, remember, if you want links to the paper itself, please head to our website, researchworks.net. And there's a CPD form there that you can fill out as well if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, we say thank you once again. Thank you, Peter. And thanks for staying up late. I know it's getting close to probably 9 o'clock there. So thank you.
Thanks very much for allowing me to spout off.
Loved it.
Oh, no.
Loved every moment of it.
We so appreciate your time.
And to everyone else, to all of our listeners, we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.